Every day, Ethan walked the same path, his steps automatic, eyes fixed on the glow of his phone screen, completely indifferent to the world around him. To him, the street was nothing more than background noise, and the man curled up beneath the awning of the abandoned shop, in worn-out clothes, holding a nearly illegible cardboard sign, was invisible. Ethan had trained himself not to notice, not to feel, not to care. But on that grey afternoon when he arrived home and found a mysterious yellow envelope waiting on the table, the script of his life began to change. No name, no stamp, no clue as to who had sent it. Inside, only an old, weathered photograph, one that held a memory far too powerful to ignore. In the image, a smiling woman held a baby in her arms, and beside her, a young man, happy and alive. Ethan recognized the face instantly, even through the cruelty of time. It was him, the man he passed by every single day without a second thought, the man dragging himself through the streets, the man whose existence he had never acknowledged. And on the back of the photo, in shaky, fading handwriting, were the words that changed everything. "You're the only good thing I ever left in this world." The world around him tilted. His heart skipped, then pounded wildly. The air thinned, and in that silent, overwhelming moment, reality screamed a truth he could no longer deny. The homeless man on the corner was his biological father. Sometimes life doesn't ask for permission to reveal itself. It just breaks through, shattering everything you thought you knew, forcing you to face the parts of yourself you've buried for too long. This story isn't just about an unexpected encounter. It's about the courage it takes to truly see who we are and who we choose to become. If this story has already stirred something in you, get ready. What comes next will challenge your deepest beliefs about family, forgiveness, and identity. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because here, every story is an invitation to look in the mirror and rediscover who you really are. Ethan had always been one of those young men who seemed to have it all together, always in the right place, doing the right thing, with a life so neatly arranged it appeared to function on precision alone. But a closer look, not at what he said, but at what he carefully avoided, would reveal that his life was held up not by peace, but by sheer willpower. He woke up at the same time every day, made his black coffee without sugar, put on his headphones before even opening the apartment door, and walked to the subway station like he was running from some kind of silence he couldn't face. What most people never knew was that this silence had been with him all along, since childhood, shaped by absences. Since the first time he asked about his father and received only a vague look in return, the kind that says more through what it doesn't say. His adoptive mother, Linda, was a strong woman, but not the kind of strong that shields itself in armor. Hers was the strength of quiet exhaustion, of forced smiles that never quite reached her eyes. She raised Ethan alone since he was 2, handed to her by a social worker who offered no answers, only that the mother had vanished and the father had never been found. Linda did what she could, maybe even more than she should have had to. She worked as a seamstress by day and a pharmacy cashier by night. Ethan grew up in a small apartment that smelled of freshly ironed fabric, where the only consistent soundtrack was the groan of an old ceiling fan that never stopped turning. On his birthdays, he'd get modest gifts wrapped with care, always with a handwritten card, because Linda believed words had the power to hold memories, and somehow they did. Even now, Ethan kept a small cardboard box hidden in his closet, filled with all the notes she'd written over the years. One read, "You are my miracle." Another, scribbled on the back of a bread bag, said, "Even when the world feels small, my love for you never fits inside it." He never showed them to anyone, but he read them on days when he needed to remember why he was still standing. Over time, Ethan became skilled at hiding, not by disappearing, but by appearing fine. He learned how to be polite without being close. He was respectful with his teachers, diligent with his work, cordial with neighbors, but always kept a safe distance from anything that demanded emotional vulnerability. His classmates said he was quiet but dependable. He didn't smile much, but he never missed a deadline. In truth, he was a master at looking okay, and only that. His relationship with Linda, though solid, bore its own quiet cracks. With time, he began to avoid certain topics: the past, his origins, the absence of a father's surname. Linda, in turn, chose to believe his silence was a sign of peace, not unrest. And so they moved through the years, loving one another, yet never touching the wounds that hurt the most. It was in adolescence that Ethan began to feel the weight of the void. Not the loud kind made of arguments and shouting, but the slow kind. The kind that eats away like water seeping through invisible cracks. He'd feel it when watching his friends being hugged by their dads after a soccer game, or hearing someone say they had their father's laugh or their mother's taste in music. It wasn't envy. It was a quiet disconnect. Like everyone else belonged to a timeline he couldn't access. In college, he moved to a new city, hoping that physical distance would make him feel whole. But he soon discovered you can't move away from yourself just by changing addresses. He studied business, interned at an insurance company, and lived in a small studio apartment with large windows that always remained closed. He called Linda twice a week. Short conversations filled with phrases like "everything's fine here" or "don't worry, I'm eating well." She never asked for more, but sometimes, on the other end of the line, he could hear the hum of that ceiling fan and a silence louder than any word. It was that silence Ethan carried through the streets, headphones in, expression neutral, footsteps quick. That's how he walked past that man on the corner for months, without realizing that the faded eyes staring back held more than he could ever imagine. It wasn't cruelty, it was self-preservation. Ethan had trained himself to avoid anything that could hurt. He donated to causes, he reposted social campaigns, he was polite to homeless people, but only to the extent that the interaction stayed safely distant, because he knew if he looked too long, he would feel. And if he felt too deeply, he might fall. And he wasn't sure he'd know how to stand up again. What he didn't know was that he was about to face the biggest mistake of his life, because ignoring a stranger on the street is a small act, but ignoring your own past is like erasing part of yourself and expecting to remain whole. Ethan had a scar at the base of his left shoulder. He never knew where it came from. Linda always said it was already there when he arrived. As a child, he'd ask if it was from playing or a fall from a bike. She would look away, and like with everything else, he learned not to press. But that night, when he received the photo in the envelope, the scar burned, as if the memory stored in his body had recognized the truth before his mind could catch up. In the days that followed, Ethan began watching the man on the corner, not like someone observes a social issue, but like someone trying to decipher a broken mirror. He noticed the sunken eyes, the way he clutched the cardboard sign with both hands, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. The subtle tremble in his fingers, the same tremble that sometimes overtook Ethan's own hand when under pressure. He started recalling small gestures. The way he ran his fingers through his hair when deep in thought, the way he clenched his jaw when hearing something uncomfortable, little pieces that suddenly felt like fragments of a puzzle never assembled. And then the doubt settled in. What if the man wasn't lying? What if that fragile message scribbled on the back of the photo was real? What if the absence he had carried all his life finally had a face? Ethan didn't know if he was ready to uncover the truth, but he knew this. If he didn't, he'd spend the rest of his life trapped inside that photograph, and somehow that hurt more than any answer ever could. Ethan moved through the 2 days, following the letter, as if walking through a minefield. Each step carried questions he didn't know how to answer, and every breath seemed to press through a wall of memories he never truly had. Memories that now demanded to be felt. He barely slept. His dreams were filled with shadows, rain-soaked streets, a man reaching out his hand, and himself turning away. He woke up with a tightness in his chest, as if something inside was on the verge of shattering. On the 3rd day, he made a decision. It wasn't courage. It was restlessness. He took the subway, got off 3 stops before work, and walked to the corner where Tommy, the man under the awning, always sat. He saw him from afar, legs crossed, eyes fixed on the ground as if there was something more worthy there than the glances of those who passed. Ethan approached slowly. His heart raced, his hands trembled. He thought about speaking, about asking, but stopped just a few feet away and watched. Tommy never noticed him. He was scribbling in a worn notebook, using a pencil far too small to be useful. There was a strange kind of grace in the gesture, as if even in ruins he was still trying to leave something beautiful behind in the world. Ethan walked away without saying a word, but something inside him had shifted. In the days that followed, he started observing Tommy more often. He memorized his routines, his movements, the way he wrapped plastic bags around his feet at night to block the cold creeping up from the pavement. Ethan began bringing him coffee, discreetly. He'd leave it on a nearby bench without approaching. Sometimes the cup sat untouched for hours. Other times it disappeared within minutes. Until one rainy night, Ethan decided to break the silence. He walked up slowly, heart torn in half, and handed Tommy the same envelope he had received days earlier. Tommy lifted his eyes with measured calm, and for the first time, they truly saw each other. There was no embrace, no immediate recognition, just a gaze that seemed to carry a lifetime of unsaid words. Tommy took the envelope gently, looked at the photo. His eyes filled with water, but his smile was soft. He didn't say, "My son." He simply said that he had waited a long time for this. Ethan said nothing. He turned and walked away. But something had been planted between them. They started seeing each other regularly. Ethan brought food, asked little, listened a lot. Tommy spoke slowly, as if afraid time wouldn't allow him to finish. He told scattered stories of a band he once tried to form in his youth, of a gas station where he worked for nearly a decade, of a woman who loved wildflowers and who disappeared with a child in her arms after a fight too painful to recall. Each word seemed to tug at a loose thread inside Ethan. Over time, routine became connection, but it remained a secret bond. Ethan told no one, not Linda, not his friends, as if admitting Tommy was his father also meant admitting everything that had always been missing. And that hurt. Then everything collapsed. It was a Friday afternoon. Ethan was having lunch with 2 co-workers when one of them made a joke about downtown ghosts. They laughed, and one pulled out his phone to show a photo he had taken earlier, a man sleeping on the sidewalk, covered in newspapers. Ethan froze. The image was clear. It was Tommy. Without thinking, he grabbed the phone and deleted the photo. The silence at the table was instant and brutal. His friend erupted, "Are you crazy? It's just some bum. He shouldn't even be there." Ethan's body shook. His voice faltered. He said simply, "That man is my father." The table went dead silent. The looks that followed were a mix of pity and discomfort. And as always happens when truths are too raw, the whispering began. By Monday, everyone knew. The stares in the halls, the veiled questions, the fake smiles. Ethan pretended none of it mattered, but something was splintering inside. That night, he went to the spot where Tommy usually stayed, but he wasn't there. nor was he the next day or the next. On the fourth night, Ethan found a police officer nearby and asked. The officer sighed. They had picked up someone matching that description 2 days earlier. He'd been sitting in front of a restaurant, accused of trying to break in. He had said he was waiting for someone, that he needed to explain something. Ethan rushed to the precinct. It was confirmed. It was Tommy. He had been arrested for trespassing and resisting. The restaurant manager, upon seeing him seated at the door, had called the police, calling him a threat. No one listened to him. No one tried to understand. He had only waited for Ethan. Through the visitation glass, Ethan saw him on the other side. Eyes tired, beard overgrown, hands resting on his lap like someone who had lost the right to gesture. Tommy smiled faintly. But he didn't say, "Why didn't you come?" He said simply that it was okay. He was used to it. Ethan left with a bitterness in his mouth no water could wash away. He wandered the city, mind in turmoil. He felt guilty, but also wounded. He never wanted this, and yet everything had exploded in his hands. In the following days, Ethan tried to get Tommy out. But it wasn't simple. They needed an address, a lawyer, someone to vouch for him. And Ethan didn't know if he was ready to be that someone. But what he didn't know is that time doesn't wait for those who hesitate. Tommy began to wither. The cell consumed him. The isolation weighed heavily. And even as Ethan tried to help, he remained paralyzed inside, until, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, he received a call from the prison hospital. Tommy had collapsed. Malnutrition, dehydration, emotional distress. Ethan rushed to the hospital. He arrived in time to find him still awake. Weak, yes, but conscious. Tommy looked at him, and for the first time, said softly that he never meant to interfere, that he had only wanted to meet him. And then he fell asleep. In that moment, Ethan understood that everything he had done was built on fear. Fear of judgment, fear of pain, fear that absence might be easier than presence. But what he didn't know was that he was about to face the greatest mistake of his life. The white corridor of the prison hospital stretched endlessly, as if time itself refused to move any faster. There was a thick silence in that place. Not the peaceful quiet of a sanctuary, but the kind that carries years of pain and stories that were cut short. Ethan approached the room slowly, carrying not only the weight of his own mistakes on his shoulders, but the emotional inheritance of everything he never had the courage to confront. Tommy was inside, lying there, fragile, held together by wires and the soft pulse of machines. And for the first time, Ethan felt he might lose him, before ever truly knowing who he was. For days, he walked the same path to the hospital, like someone seeking redemption through quiet steps. He sat by the bed for hours, just watching. Sometimes he'd bring fruit and leave it on the table, unsure if Tommy had the strength to eat. Other times, he simply allowed himself to breathe in that space where, strangely, time seemed more honest than anywhere else. Slowly, between the monitor's beeps and muffled nurse voices, Ethan began to speak. Not rehearsed lines, not questions about the past, but fragments of himself. Unresolved memories, silent regrets, ancient doubts he had never dared to voice. He spoke of a childhood that tried so hard to look normal, of an adolescence where absence became identity, of a life built upon the desperate attempt to prove something to himself. He spoke of the anguish of being no one's son, of carrying a borrowed name with no story, of falling asleep each night with the sense that someone, somewhere, was judging him silently. Tommy, most of the time, listened with his eyes closed. He would nod slowly now and then, as if hearing echoes of his own life, now relived through the voice of a son he barely knew, yet somehow recognized in cadence, in tone, in pain. But the fragile connection that had started to take shape between them was suddenly and violently disrupted. It began with an unexpected phone call from Linda, the adoptive mother who had always been his safe harbor, now speaking in a voice he barely recognized. The news was impossible to absorb. Josh, his best friend, had been arrested for involvement in a banking fraud scheme. And worse still, part of the evidence pointed directly to systems Ethan used daily at work. His computer, his logins, his company. Everything seemed to have been manipulated to incriminate him too. What began as disbelief quickly turned into a storm of fear. Ethan struggled to understand how someone so close could have gotten involved in something so dark without his knowledge. He felt betrayed, exposed, vulnerable, and yet a part of him still hoped there was some explanation. A trap, a mistake. But the justice system doesn't wait for emotional clarity. Faced with data, digital traces, and suspicious transfers, Ethan became a suspect in a game he didn't understand. It was like being trapped inside invisible walls pressing in with enough force to pull the ground from beneath him. He raced from police stations to lawyers to former co-workers, trying to make sense of it all. But the way people looked at him had changed. Their eyes now carried a familiar kind of silent judgment, the same one Ethan had cast on Tommy for years. The irony was painful. Ethan, who had spent so long running from even the appearance of weakness or fault, now wore the label of liability. He was no longer safe. He was someone to be questioned, to be watched. And it was in that moment, when he felt emptied of certainty, stripped of support, that the cruelest realization hit. The only person who could truly help him now, the only one who understood what it meant to be accused without evidence, discarded without defense, was the very man he had once condemned to oblivion. The man he broke had become his only hope. That realization pushed Ethan into action. Armed with Tommy's full medical records and backed by the hospital's social worker, he secured an emergency, supervised release. It wasn't freedom, but it was enough to return him to the streets, not to live there again, but to search through alleys and forgotten faces for a thread, a name, a truth that might save Ethan's future. Tommy, though weak, accepted, without hesitation. The frailty of his body didn't dull the clarity in his mind. He knew the city from the inside out, from the cracks no one else sees. Ethan drove them down roads he had never taken, listening to stories between coughing, fits and scattered memories. They stopped at places where old contacts still wandered, where dangerous names were whispered, where truths weren't handed over. They had to be earned. Somewhere between an abandoned gas station and a warehouse fronting illegal activity, Ethan first heard about someone linked to money laundering and digital fraud. A man often seen around the same circles as Josh. The tip came almost as a confession from one of Tommy's contacts, and it felt like air in the middle of a drowning, thin, uncertain, but still air. As they chased clues, Ethan began to see Tommy differently. In small gestures, the careful way he folded a napkin, how he watched people on the street with a kind of quiet poetry. He noticed a sensitivity he never thought to look for. The toughness had been a shield, the silence, armor. The dirt and neglect were never who he was, just the skin the world forced on him. And with each day that passed, guilt settled heavier in Ethan's chest. Not for his image, not for his job, but for finally realizing the cost Tommy had paid for being invisible to his own son. The case was far from resolved, but something between them had begun to build. Not trust, not yet, not forgiveness, not out loud, but a new space, a space where two broken men could stand side by side, not as perpetrator and victim, but as survivors of the same absence. And for the first time, Ethan began to understand that redemption doesn't come when everything goes back to the way it was. It comes when, in the middle of the storm, someone chooses to stay. What he still didn't know was that the pain he carried, was only the surface, and that the deepest truth, the one that could heal or destroy him, was still to come. Time didn't rewind. No gesture could erase what had been said, done, or left unsaid. But slowly, the layers of pain began to make room for something neither Ethan nor Tommy could name with certainty. Maybe it wasn't forgiveness. Maybe it was just the beginning of a possible coexistence between two men, marked by silence. What once was absence was now filled with small gestures, not grand declarations, but quiet presences that spoke louder than any explanation ever could. Ethan's legal troubles began to clear as new evidence came to light. Josh's connection to the scheme was confirmed, and although Ethan's name still appeared in official documents as a witness and indirect party, the shadow of suspicion began to fade. There would still be hearings, testimonies, and the work of restoring his reputation, but the worst had passed, and he knew that none of it would have been possible without Tommy. There was no single moment when things between them got fixed, no transformative conversation, no redemptive scene. But there was a morning when Ethan passed by the temporary housing unit where Tommy had been placed and noticed a plant on the windowsill. A tiny sapling, fragile but alive. He recognized the pot. It was the one he'd bought months earlier, the one he never had the courage to deliver. Seeing it there, quietly growing, was enough to understand that something had been accepted, not forgotten, not resolved, but integrated. Over time, Tommy was transferred to a social reintegration program, a discreet project with no grand infrastructure, but one that offered basic housing, medical care, and weekly workshops for formerly homeless individuals in extreme vulnerability. He didn't complain. He didn't ask for anything. He just accepted. Like someone who knows that survival in itself is already a form of resistance. Ethan, on his end, changed his habits. He began walking more, turning off his phone more often, looking people in the eyes when they spoke. His relationship with Linda, once reduced to short phone calls and protective phrases, evolved into longer visits, lingering hugs, and silences. That felt safe. He no longer needed to prove anything, not to her, not to the world, not even to himself. There was one day in particular that carved itself into his memory stronger than any other. A typical Saturday. The sky was overcast. The air carried that earthy scent that precedes a light storm. Ethan stopped by the market and picked up fruit, then walked to the modest cottage where Tommy now lived, surrounded by short trees and the distant sound of children playing at a nearby public school. He hadn't called ahead. He just went. He found Tommy sitting outside with a newspaper on his lap and a pen in hand. He was doing a crossword puzzle. Beside him, a glass of lukewarm tea and a book on gardening. Ethan said nothing. He sat on the porch step, placed the bags at his side, and simply stayed. They remained like that for nearly an hour. Neither broke the silence with words, but something in that moment sealed a kind of unspoken agreement, a silent pact between two survivors. There was, at last, room for coexistence. Over time, Ethan began participating in discussion groups on social reintegration, not as an expert, but as someone who had looked prejudice in the eye and realized that true justice isn't found only in court rulings or acquittals, but in our capacity to recognize humanity where the world insists on seeing only failure. He didn't speak much, but his story spoke volumes, and the way others listened showed that sometimes pain is the most honest bridge between two distant worlds. Tommy, in turn, rebuilt his life quietly. He regularly attended workshops, planted small community gardens, and wrote short essays in notebooks he never showed anyone. He'd say they weren't meant for the world. They were to remind himself where he came from and why he was still here. Ethan never explicitly apologized, and Tommy never said he forgave him. But between them, their actions began to speak. a language only the broken can understand. They started seeing each other often, sometimes in silence, sometimes on short walks through the city. Other times, in discreet visits to Linda's home, where Tommy was welcomed with a simple cake and a look that blended surprise with gentle restraint. The city kept turning. Days passed, headlines changed, people forgot. But for them, nothing ever returned to the way it was. And strangely, that was a good thing, because what followed wasn't about fixing, it was about building something new from what remained. No rush, no promises. One afternoon, Ethan found the old box where he had kept his childhood notes. At the bottom, among yellowed papers and folded letters, he found the photo he had received at the very beginning, the one where a smiling woman held a baby in her arms, and beside her, a man whose smile life had buried for far too long. He stared at it for a long while, but this time he didn't feel pain. He felt presence, he felt continuity. He felt that, despite everything, something good had indeed been left in the world. In the final scene of this story, there are no cinematic revelations, no last-minute twists, just two men sitting side by side beneath the soft shade of a tree, looking out at the city that once ignored them, but now, quietly, sees them. The pain didn't disappear, but it stopped being an open wound. It became a scar, and every scar, by definition, is proof that pain existed, but so did healing. Some stories don't end with a period, they continue, silent but pulsing, inside those who dared to feel, and this was one of them. Ethan and Tommy never went back to who they were. But maybe that was the best outcome of all, because every mistake they faced, every truth once denied and then embraced, every unspoken gesture still lived, built a new way of existing between them. Not perfect, but real. And for those who've lived a life surrounded by absence, that's close to a miracle. This story reminds us that the past can hurt, but it can also heal. That pain can break us, but it can also teach us how to begin again. And that sometimes the person we avoid the most is the very one holding the missing piece of who we are. If this story stirred something in you, if it brought back memories, questions, or feelings, don't let it fade into silence. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and most of all, subscribe to the channel, because here, every story is a mirror, and every time we see ourselves in someone else, we understand ourselves a little more. And if you think you've seen enough for today, think again. There's another story waiting for you. A new journey that might challenge, move, and transform you. Click now and stay with us, because here, feeling is just the beginning.